This is the Southport Armchair History, and I'm Liz Fuller, and today we're going to be talking about Southport and the women's right to vote. All right, this is the third in our five-part series on early 20th century Southport history, and it's being presented in collaboration with Harper Library and Friends of the Library, Southport and Oak Island. So far in this series, we've talked about World War I and the flu pandemic of 1918, and we've seen how throughout both of these crises, the people of Southport pulled together to face unexpected challenges that war and disease brought to their doorstep. So this week, we're going to talk about women's right to vote. And rather than reacting to events, we'll get to see the people of Southport, especially the women of Southport, exhibiting leadership and taking positive action for their community and for their rights as citizens. When most people think of the women's right to vote, they think of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And we will be discussing them a little in our talk today, but we're not going to be focusing on them. And in part, that's because it took so long for the fight for women to have the right to vote. It took so long that by the time, even though these women lived into their mid-80s, neither of them lived long enough to see it happen. So I'm going to need everybody to check their mics. There's a whirring noise. Thank you. So here's the timeline for this week's class. The top line shows just how long women pursued the right to vote. Of course, women had been asking for it since the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were written, but as we know, the founders decided to leave that particular decision up to the individual states. So back in 1848, women started to organize around the right to vote and also other women's rights. They held a convention in New York State, and that's when Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton got involved in the quest for a vote. In 1865, the 15th Amendment was ratified, and that amendment gave the right to vote to African American men, but still not to women. And that was quite a blow to the women fighting for voting rights, many of whom had been abolitionists. So in 1869, the National Women's Suffrage Association was formed. And not long after that, some women, including Susan B. Anthony, actually went to the polls to vote, and they were arrested for their behavior. Susan B. Anthony stood trial and was found guilty of breaking the law. She was fined $100, which she refused to pay, and she never did pay for her entire life. In another case, a Missouri woman who was denied the right to vote sued the registrator for prohibiting her from registering. She claimed that she was a US citizen and that one of the constitutional rights of citizenship was the right to vote. The case ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court. And the women in the women's groups were really excited because they thought this was going to be it. They would then get the right to vote by a Supreme Court decision. But that didn't happen. The Supreme Court ruled against her, stating that voting was not a constitutional right of all citizens. So that was another big blow to the women's suffrage organization. So they were still determined, they didn't give up. What they did next was they submitted a bill to Congress to amend the Constitution. And this bill became known as the Susan B. Anthony Bill. And as you can see on the timeline, it was submitted in 1878. It would be more than 40 years before that bill was finally passed in 1919. So the bottom line is the timeline frame that we're going to be focusing on today. It begins in 1909 with the formation of the Southport Civic Club, and it ends in 1920 when for the first time many of the women in Southport were eligible to vote. So let's start by taking a look at this controversial 19th Amendment so we can understand why it took so many decades to pass. So this is the actual wording of the amendment that took over 70 years of effort to get passed. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's it. So as I said, it's hard today to imagine just how controversial this was and how strong the opposition to it was, but we're going to see that it was. But first, I want to address a couple of common misconceptions about women's suffrage. Many people in the United States, when you ask them, they think that we were the first country that gave women the right to vote, but that is not the case. There were actually 15 countries that gave women the right to vote before the United States. Another misconception is that no women in the United States had the right to vote prior to the 19th Amendment. But again, that's not true. There were already states where women had full voting rights in all elections. And then there were still others where they had partial rights. So the dark green states gave full suffrage to women, and Wyoming was the first. And the light green gave partial rights. Now, the light yellow are where women had absolutely no right to vote. Does anyone notice any pattern to those states? Anything jump out at you?
While we're in the South, honey.
That seems to me to be the pattern, Pat, although it does have Pennsylvania included in there. And there are some southern states where there's partial rights. So it was largely the South, and including North Carolina. Absolutely no voting rights for women. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what it was like to be a woman in Southport during those years before women had the right to vote. So this is an early picture of Jessie Stevens Taylor, back when her name was still Jessie Stevens. And those of you who attended Bob's talk on Tuesday heard him mention Jessie. Now, I like this picture, first of all, because she looks so young and happy and pretty in it. But there's more to this picture than you first notice. You'll notice that both young women are standing with their bicycles. Now, in the 1890s, when this picture was taken, bicycles were often seen as an instrument of feminism. You see, bicycles gave women increased mobility and independence. Women riding bikes was quite controversial. In fact, many people, including doctors, thought that bicycling was not suitable for women because it was so tiring. And not only that, it would lead to a serious condition known as bicycle face. It was believed that women would be working so hard to pedal and concentrating so hard on maintaining their balance that they would turn all red and sweaty, and they would scrunch up their faces, and that they would eventually stay that way and leave them unattractive and undesirable. So Susan B. Anthony had a different view of bicycles. She said, "Let me tell you what I think of bicycles. I think bicycling has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. It gives women a feeling of freedom and self-reliance. I stand and rejoice every time I see a woman ride by on a wheel, the picture of free, untrammeled womanhood." And I think that that is what I like best about this picture. It shows Jessie Stevens in a moment of free and untrammeled womanhood. Now, Jessie was not actually born in Southport. She moved here with her family from Chicago when she was 9 years old. She attended Smithville Academy, and the principal at that school was Kate Stewart, another woman that Bob mentioned on Tuesday. That's Kate up in the corner. I forgot to put her name there. Jessie's father, E.B. Stevens, was a business leader in Southport. Her husband, C.E. Taylor, whom she married in 1909, was a rising attorney. Both men were proponents of bringing the railroad to town. Jessie also had ambitions for Southport. She wanted the town to be ready for the increased business and visitors that the railroad would bring to town. There were issues of cleanliness, safety, and beautification that needed to be addressed. So Jessie decided to start a women's club. There was a social movement in the United States at that time that was known as the Women's Club movement. It established the idea that women had a moral duty and responsibility to transform public policy. And this movement was especially embraced by white middle-class Protestant women. Most of these clubs started out as social and literary gatherings, but they eventually became a source of reform for various issues surrounding education, temperance, environmental protection, library creation, schools, and more. The clubs allowed women who had little political standing at the time to gain greater influence in their community. And they also gave women opportunities for leadership, organization, networking, public speaking, and roles that they might never have had the opportunity to do. Jessie engaged many of the leading ladies of the town, including the mayor's wife, to join the club, which they named the Southport Civic Club. In particular, she tapped her former principal, Kate Stewart, to be the club's first president. Kate was the proprietor of the Stewart House Inn and a significant landowner in Southport. She was the only woman on the Chamber of Commerce, and she had close connections to the lawyers and judges of the county court, as many of them stayed at her inn whenever they were in town. And Kate was also working hard to bring the railroad to town. She, like the other business leaders in town, all hoped that Southport would fulfill its destiny and become the port of the South. So the members of the Civic Club got busy. They persuaded local businesses to use trash barrels instead of throwing their trash into the street. And then they got them to move the barrels back behind their business because they would burn the trash in those barrels, and it was better to be done in the back. They painted street signs. They put benches in front of the garrison lawn. They promoted planting flowers and gardens and cleaning up the cemetery by having beautification contests. They also promoted better child health through education and better baby parades. They opened the first library in Southport in the east wing of the garrison at Fort Johnston. They provided over 400 books, and they paid the salary of the librarian. They also focused on public health by trying to reduce the proliferation of sand spurs and the breeding grounds for mosquitoes. And all of this was accomplished in the first 10 years of the club's existence. But despite women having no opportunity to vote in North Carolina, the Civic Club was focused on politics from the very beginning. One of the first activities the club arranged was a steamboat trip to Wilmington to hear President Taft speak. The ladies all met at the pier at 6 in the morning, and they took the morning passage to Wilmington, where they could hear the president for themselves. Since this was an era before internet and television or even the radio, hearing a president speak firsthand was a rare opportunity, especially in North Carolina. The women continued their political activities after that by inviting the mayor and the aldermen to several of their meetings to discuss their concerns about the town and to align on their plans to address the challenges facing the community. So are there any questions at this point about the Southport Civic Club or the women of Southport at that time? Okay, I'm going to go on then. Feel free to interrupt me at any time. So while the women of Southport were working to improve their town, the women in Washington, D.C. were working to improve their country. Two of these women were Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul. So when the Susan B. Anthony bill failed to get any traction in Congress, remember it just floundered there for about 40 years, Carrie Catt decided to focus her energies on the states. So she and the National Women's Suffrage Association started working with state legislatures to get women the vote. And they made progress, but it was very slow. By 1912, only 9 states had actually given women the right to vote. So one of Catt's first actions as president, she implemented the Society Plan. And that was a campaign to recruit wealthy members of the rapidly growing women's club movement. These women had time, money, and experience, and it was thought that they could help the suffrage movement. Now, looking through the records of the Southport Civic Club, there's no mention of women's rights in their minutes. So I don't think that was the real focus of theirs, and coming from a small town in North Carolina, they probably wouldn't have been a target demographic for Mrs. Catt. Another woman involved in this effort was Alice Paul. Now, from my perspective, I see some similarities between Alice Paul and Jessie Stevens Taylor. They were approximately the same age, and they both had a great deal of self-confidence and vision, and they both knew how to get things done. Alice Paul had spent time working with the suffragettes in the United Kingdom. Now, the British women took a much more violent approach to suffrage than the women in the United States. When Alice returned to the States, she grew impatient with this state-by-state approach, and instead she wanted to refocus on the constitutional amendment and get women the vote all at once. Now, Paul was a Quaker, so she didn't believe in violence, but she preferred to use civil disobedience. But even that was seen as radical when it was performed by middle-class women. So Paul's first idea was to hold a parade, and not just any parade, but a parade composed entirely of women, marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. on the day before the inauguration of the newly elected president, Woodrow Wilson. She and her organization recruited 5,000 women, and they created 24 floats, and they marched down the main thoroughfares of Washington. She persuaded the labor lawyer Inez Milholland to dress as a woman warrior astride a white horse to lead the procession. She grouped the women by their occupation and by their location. So she had all the nurses walking together, all the teachers, she had all the college graduates wearing their caps and gowns walking together, and then she had all the delegates from Ohio or Illinois or Pennsylvania all walking together. And then she broke up these groups of women marching with the floats. So in this picture, these women are marching holding placards, and these placards contain signatures of 1 million women, so that they could show that it was not just them, that they were representing even larger numbers of women that could not be there that day. Now, Paul instructed all of the women to dress well and to dress femininely, because she wanted to contradict stereotypes that feminists were unfeminine and unattractive. And she told them to march with dignity and poise, as though they would be responsible voters. Now, while a parade doesn't seem too radical to us today, it was at the time. There had never been a parade of women this large. And there was still a perception at that time that the only women who walked in the streets by themselves without men to accompany them were, well, streetwalkers. It was a spectacle to see so many women self-confidently striding down the street on their own without men to guard them. One challenge that Alice Paul faced in organizing her parade was what to do with the African American women who showed up for the parade and wanted to participate and demonstrate for their rights as citizens. Now, this question of what to do about Black women wasn't just a problem with the parade, it was a problem with the entire women's rights movement. It was threatening enough to think of white women voting, but the idea of African American women voting was truly threatening to the establishment. So the National Women's Suffrage organizations tried to downplay the involvement of Black women. Paul worried that if she allowed the women to appear too publicly, she risked losing the support of the Southern constituents. So she told the African American women, some of whom had traveled across the country at their own expense to be there, to walk at the back of the parade. One woman who refused to march in the back was Ida Wells from Chicago. Ida was an investigative journalist, an educator, and a civil rights advocate best known for her work to fight lynching in America. She told Paul that she would march with them or not at all. As the parade started, she stood on the sidelines. When the Illinois delegates marched past, she stepped out of the crowd and joined the white women from her state. She marched with them, walking between two white supporters. At first, everything went smoothly for the marching women, but gradually the crowds of onlookers, an estimated 500,000 people, disrupted the parade with jeers and mockery. Men refused to clear the way for the parading women, and when the police failed to intervene, things got violent. One observer remembered women were spit upon, slapped in the face, tripped up, pelted with burning cigar stubs, and insulted by jeers and obscene language that was too vile to print or repeat. Over 200 people were injured, and another 169 were arrested for obstructing traffic once they reached the White House. One observer said, "Through all the confusion and turmoil, the women marched calmly, keeping a military formation as best they could." Now, it should be noted that the reason the police did little to contain the violence is because they believed the women shouldn't be marching in the first place, and they had brought it on themselves. From Paul's point of view, even with the violence, the parade was a smashing success and a turning point in the movement. By overshadowing Wilson's inauguration, the suffragists had made it clear that they would not be ignored. But even though the parade got publicity for the cause, it still didn't accomplish the goal of getting the amendment passed. So Alice's next idea was to picket the White House. Now again, this sounds rather tame now, but at the time it had never been done before. The Washington Herald called the effort the most militant move ever made by the suffragists of this country. So once again, Alice paid great attention to detail. She told the women how to dress and how to behave. The protesters did not sing or chant or march or engage with the public. They were called silent sentinels. They simply stood at the entrances to the White House, and they made sure that the president was forced to see them whenever he was coming or going. They held large banners, and they let those banners speak for themselves. They appeared every single day, rain or shine. Women came from all over the country to participate in these protests, and Alice arranged specific days for nurses or teachers or wage earners to protest. And she had days for women from specific states or cities. And in all, over 2,000 women took part in the pickets, many of them traveling long distance to participate. Each woman worked a 4-hour shift, which could seem very long when it was in bad weather. They started the pickets in January, and after a few months, it appeared like it might be working. People were becoming more and more aware of their cause, and they were maybe even becoming sympathetic. But then it was April of 1917. And from our previous classes, we know that in April of 1917 was when President Wilson went before Congress and asked them to declare war on Germany in order to make the world safe for democracy. And without any sense of irony, he said that we shall fight for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments. Now, when war was declared, the main body of the Suffrage Association, that was led by Mrs. Catt, decided that they needed to focus their efforts on supporting the war effort. They felt that now was not the time to pursue changes in the government, and so they backed off on pursuing the right to vote. But Alice Paul saw no reason to back off. In fact, she increased the pressure on Wilson. She ramped up her banners, and she started using his own words against him. She wanted everyone to see the hypocrisy of a nation fighting a foreign war for democracy when its own citizens didn't have the right to vote. The public, which had started to be sympathetic to the cause, turned on the women. They didn't think the women should be criticizing the president in the time of war. Passers-by started to heckle them and throw things at them. Eventually, the police began to arrest them for protesting and charged them with obstruction of traffic. At first, the punishments were small, a fine or a few days in jail. The women refused to pay the fines, saying that doing so would admit they were guilty when they hadn't committed any crime, and so instead they served jail time. Eventually, the punishments got more and more severe until Alice Paul was sentenced to prison for 7 months. One night in November 1917, 33 women were arrested all at once, and the prison superintendent told his guards to teach the women a lesson. They were beaten and tortured all night in an incident that became known as the Night of Terror. Alice Paul and some of the other women began a hunger strike in protest of the unfair treatment of the women suffragists and to raise awareness that they were being held as political prisoners. Now, the authorities didn't want the women to die and become martyrs for their cause, So they began force feeding them, which is a brutal and torturous treatment. Soon, word got out about how the United States was treating these women simply for peacefully protesting their inability to vote, and the women were released. On January 9th, 1918, almost a year to the day after the Silent Sentinels began their militant protest, President Wilson announced his support for a federal amendment for women's suffrage. 2 months later, the arrests, the trials, and the punishments of the picketers were ruled unconstitutional by the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. So up until that point, Wilson had always contended that the question of women's suffrage was a state issue. His change of heart was due to several reasons. In part, it was the pressure and the embarrassment of Alice Paul's public stunts. It was also the behind-the-scenes lobbying by the larger women's suffrage organization led by Carrie Catt. And then it was also the growing sentiment of the nearly 2 million women who already had the right to vote because they were becoming a stronger political power, those few states that they had managed to get the right to vote to. And then finally, and very importantly, it was the contribution of the nearly 9 million women who supported the war effort, either by joining the Red Cross or backfilling for the men who had gone overseas, or serving themselves in the military as nurses, ambulance drivers, and telephone operators. So in September of 1918, Wilson addressed Congress, and in part he said, "We have made partners of the women in this war. Should we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege?" 7 months later, the 19th Amendment was passed, and it was sent to the states to be ratified. Now, the amendment moved really pretty swiftly through the process of getting 2/3 votes, in part because by then 20 states already had at least partial voting rights for women. But there was still considerable opposition, especially in North Carolina and other southern states. So what was their concern? So while men were involved in the anti-suffrage movement in the United States, amazingly, most anti-suffrage groups were actually led and supported by women. These women viewed voting as a burden that women shouldn't be forced to take on. They felt women were too delicate to endure the physical and intellectual strain of politics. They worried that it would ruin the family and turn the relationships between the sexes all around. It would make women unfeminine. And they also were pretty sure that suffragists were socialists. So here are some postcards from that time that give you an idea of what people were thinking. The one on the left has the origin and development of a suffragette. So at 15, a little pet. At 20, a little coquette. At 40, not married yet. And at 50, a suffragette. And then we see this gathering of the suffragettes, and we see these women, they've got these signs, "Down with men, husbands for old maids," and it says, "At the suffragette meetings, you can hear some plain things, and see them too." So the joke was, you know, these women were plain and old maids and unattractive, and they couldn't get any men, so they wanted to take their power. Or take the men. This one said that when women vote, apparently men were no longer going to have any say in who they married. Women were just going to force them into marriage at any time, any place, anywhere. And we saw weddings while you wait, registry office open all day and night, marriages by the hour, day, or job, whatever that means. And another big fear was that the whole roles were going to switch, and all of a sudden it would be women sitting around and playing cards and eating chocolate and smoking cigarettes and talking trash about their husbands, when the husbands would be back at home taking care of the babies and doing the laundry and doing all the hard work, which is just topsy-turvy. And then we have these, "What will men wear when women wear the pants?" And this little girl, "Nobody loves me, guess I'll be a suffragette." And then this woman going off to the polls on election day, leaving her poor husband with the children, and she has a sampler on the wall that says, "What is a suffragette without a suffering family?" So these showed all of the fears, the concerns, the fear-mongering that was going on, but they're not really the underlying issues that there were against women's voting. These just played on people's fears and biases and basically distracted them. The deep-seated reasons, there were additional deep-seated reasons against the bill. As long as our country has had democracy, there have been people who have tried to control who could vote. And for the most part, people have tried to stop other people from voting if they thought they were going to vote the wrong way. So some of the strongest opponents of women voting were those who were afraid of how she would vote. So in general, the liquor industry had always been a strong opponent of women voting rights because they thought it would lead to prohibition. Of course, by the time that the Women's Voting Right Amendment passed, prohibition was already the law of the land. In North Carolina, the textile mills were especially opposed to women voting because they thought that if women had the right to vote, it would lead to reductions in child labor and extensive work hours, and they would cause an increase in safety precautions. They felt if women had the right to vote, they would object to 7-year-old boys working 67 hours a week and being barefoot as they climbed on these machines to try and change the spools and get themselves mangled. Somehow they thought women would be against that. And then there was the question of states' rights. Throughout the South, including North Carolina, there was a large concern that giving women the vote would open the door for Black women to vote. Voting among African American men had been suppressed since 1900 through the implementation of literacy tests and the grandfather clause. So many were concerned that giving women the vote would open up all of that back up again. So it's important to realize that at that time, North Carolina was nearly 100% Democrat. It was assumed that if Black women got the right to vote, they would register Republican, the party of Abraham Lincoln, as most African Americans always had. So increasing the number of Black votes meant increasing the number of Republican votes. So many Democrats and white supremacists argued that suffrage was a state's right to decide, not the federal government's. They argued that if it was a state law and it didn't work out, then the state could change their mind and eliminate it. Of course, several times women had tried to get the right to vote as a state right in North Carolina, and it had been defeated. There were also white supremacists who felt that women's suffrage would be a good thing for the cause. They had done the math, and they calculated that since white women outnumbered Black women in North Carolina, that even if Black women got the right to vote, the whites would still have a majority, so that adding more whites to the voting rolls could only help their cause. Down in Southport, the men and women of Brunswick County were trying to educate themselves about the Anthony Amendment, as it was called. A woman from the Baltimore division of the women's suffrage named Lola C. Trax, along with representatives of the North Carolina Equal Suffrage Association and local sympathizers, spoke at the courthouse in favor of the amendment. Attendance was so high by both men and women that it was standing room only. Okay, now the reasons for these roses on this slide is that they were symbols of which side people came down on. People didn't wear t-shirts back then with slogans on them. Instead, they wore flowers to indicate what their views were. So those who were anti-suffrage wore a red rose, and those who were for it wore a yellow one. And as each state legislature met to decide the votes, men and women wore flowers on their lapels indicating which way they would vote. The women were just in the audience. The men were the ones who were voting. So once an amendment is passed by the federal legislature, like this one had been, it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. In 1919, that meant 36 states had to approve it. So in August 1919, when the Anthony Amendment came up for a vote in North Carolina, 35 of those 36 states had already approved it. The next state to approve it would make it an official amendment to the Constitution. So I have a question for you guys. Do you think, did North Carolina vote for it and become the 36th state to approve it? Or did they vote against it? Which way do you think?
Against.
What was that?
Against.
Against? You think against? Anybody else? Anybody think for?
Well, yeah, since you're asking the question, I'm going to go with against.
Oh, against? Okay, you think North Carolina voted against? Okay. Against? Against? Against. Okay. All right. Everybody.
It makes sense that it would be against, but I'm going to be positive and go for.
All right. Positive, Loretta. Okay. All right. Everybody mute your mics and I'll tell you the answer. Okay. Well, actually, that was a trick question because what North Carolina actually decided to do was they decided to table the decision until the following year. So, of course, they knew that there wouldn't be a following year, that the decision would be made before then, but that way they didn't have to take a stand one way or the other. And the next state on the list was Tennessee. So right away, the North Carolina legislature quickly sent a telegram to Tennessee and they said, hey, this is what we did. You do this too. We'll let some other state like Connecticut or Vermont be the last one to ratify it. So it went to Tennessee. And when the Tennessee legislature met the following week, that was their plan. They were going to vote to table the amendment. Now, this man here in this slide is Harry T. Byrne. He was the youngest member of the legislature. He was only 24 years old in 1920. He had been 22 when he was elected, and most of the men in the legislature were in their 60s. So some of them had taken Harry under their wing, and they advised him on how he should behave and even on how he should vote. So Harry knew the plan, and he was in agreement with postponing the vote on the amendment. He came in that day wearing his red flower on his lapel, like his friends and his elders, and he'd agreed to follow their more experienced lead. But, as so often happens, things didn't go according to plan. When the vote came to table the amendment, Harry voted with his friends, but the count was a tie, 48 to 48. The motion didn't pass. So instead of tabling the vote on the amendment, the Assembly decided they would vote that date on the amendment. It meant that if any one man in the room changed his vote, the tie would be broken. If two men did, the required majority would be met, and the motion would either pass or fail, depending on who it was that changed their mind. So, as Harry Burns sat there waiting to cast his vote, the enormity of his decision settled upon him. In his pocket was a letter from his mother. She had written to him that day, and she advised him to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat with her rats, meaning ratification, meaning vote for women's suffrage. So when it came Harry's turn to vote, he surprised everyone in the chamber, and maybe even himself, by casting an aye vote. In the uproar that followed, one other legislator changed his vote, and to the consternation of many in the room, the 19th Amendment of the Constitution became law. Later, Harry said that as he sat there waiting his turn to vote, he thought about how his mother was the smartest person he knew, and yet she was not allowed to vote. He said, I knew that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow, and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification. He said, I appreciated the fact that an opportunity such as seldom comes to a mortal man to free 17 million women from political slavery was mine. And in Washington, D.C., Alice Paul and the women of the National Women's Party celebrated their victory. Of course, since it was Prohibition, it was the law of the land that she was toasting with grape juice there in that side. So back in Southport, it appears there was a great deal of support for the amendment, at least among the women of the Civic Club and the local government. Anna Miller Davis, a young married woman, became the first woman to register to vote in Brunswick County. Anna had moved to Southport in her teens along with her parents and her brother. Her brother had been killed in the military the year before. Her parents were German immigrants who owned the popular Miller Hotel and Cafe on the corner of Howe and Bay Street. And that's a picture of it right there. It's no longer standing, but that shows you the Miller Hotel. Anna's father was also involved in politics. He was actually a registered socialist and had run for governor of North Carolina the previous year, but had garnered only 3 votes in Brunswick County. So Anna registered, although there's no indication that she registered as a socialist. After Anna registered to vote, she was asked to participate in some educational programs encouraging other women to vote. The mayor, J.W. Rourke, also presented in these programs, which were sponsored by the Southport Civic Club, which by then had changed its name to the Southport Women's Club. The Women's Club held other educational programs with presentations by the former mayor, R.W. Davis, and a series of classes on citizenship rights and duties. The members of the Women's Club went door to door in Southport, encouraging women to register to vote. So the 19th Amendment was a big victory for women in Southport and across the country. But there's one final misconception about the 19th Amendment that I'd like to discuss, and that was that from that point on, all women were able to vote. But unfortunately, that was not the case, even in Southport. If you'll recall last week, we talked about a young Southport woman named Anna Clemens. Now, Anna was a trained nurse with several years' experience. She had been unable to help in the war effort because she was African American and the military was not accepting any Black women as nurses. But she had been available to help with the 1918 flu epidemic at great personal risk, even receiving a certificate for her heroism. But even after that sacrifice, when she went to register to vote, she was turned away. Now, this was 1920. It was a period of intense racial violence in this country. In fact, 1919, the year before, had been the deadliest year in this country's history in terms of racial violence. Over 1,000 African Americans across the United States, both in the South and in the North, were killed by white mobs through lynching, arson, and other acts of violence. Across the entire country, participation in the Klan was at the highest it had ever been. So all that is to say that it took a lot of courage for Anna to attempt to vote. But then, after she was turned away, she did something even more courageous. She decided to write a letter. And who did she write that letter to? The National Women's Party in Washington, D.C., the organization that was run by none other than Alice Paul. So since I don't have a picture of Anna, I put up a picture of Alice Paul just to help you remember what organization she's writing to. But here's Anna's letter. She wrote to the National Women's Party, Washington, D.C., to the secretary of the above party. I am an American colored woman, property owner in Brunswick County, state of North Carolina, and I am seeking a way to vote by mail if there is a way, because a colored person in my county is unable to vote because they are colored. Please send me information how to send votes or register to general headquarters by mail before it is too late to register. I'm obliged, Miss Anna A. Clemens, Box 294, Southport, North Carolina. So Anna received a response from the National Women's Party. The secretary, Emma Wold, pictured here, wrote her back. It appears that Ms. Wold didn't entirely understand Anna's situation. She said, "My dear Miss Clemens, your letter of October 10th inquiring about registration and voting by mail in North Carolina has just come in my hands. Registration must be made in person in North Carolina and in the precinct in which you live. It is possible to vote by mail on applying for a ballot to the county board. Registrations close on October 23rd. As you undoubtedly understand, no one may register or vote outside of his own precinct. We have been making inquiries and learned that colored women are being registered in North Carolina. Have you tried personally? If not, will you try? And let us know the result. Should the registration board refuse to register you, we shall be glad to look into the matter and see what can be done about it. Please be sure to let us know the result of your attempt to register. Very sincerely yours, Emma Wold, headquarters secretary. Well, Anna received that letter and she wrote back. She tried to detail her experiences and try to convey how vulnerable she was if word of her letters got out. She said, "My dear Miss Wold, in your letter, which was duly received yesterday, will take the greatest of pleasure to write you my result in attempting or trying to register. I went before the registrator October 15th and was refused to be registered, as this board requires all colored to be able to read and write to suit the registrator, and all persons of colored origin in this whole county have been unable to suit the registrator. North Carolina laws require one to be able to read and write to register. Still, we have in our county ones to fill requirements, but then they are refused. I hope and ask if you should have this matter investigated, then please do not let my name be brought into this matter, because there is so much prejudice existing until I am most assured I will be a victim of lawless mob. To show you I am no agitator or race leader, I will try to explain just my position. I am a nurse, have nursed in most every home in this town for the past 9 years, acting at times as assistant to one of the South's best surgeons, Dr. J. Arthur Dosher of this county. I donated to the Red Cross, volunteered during the epidemic of the 1918 flu, and hold a certificate for heroic services rendered over my state. I own property and pay my tax. I'm a Christian, belong to the Methodist Church, attend to my own business. I don't interfere with no race of people, and I try to live here as I expect to live when I pass in the great beyond. That is, in peace. I have 7 brothers, law-abiding, supposed to be citizens, denied the same as myself. Hoping and resting assured you will not use my name in this matter, that I will close. From Anna A. Clemens, Box 294, Southport. So Anna received one more letter from the women's group. She said, Emma Wold said, "My dear Mrs. Clemens, I've called Miss Paul's attention to your letter of October 24th, describing the registration conditions for colored women in your neighborhood. We have been giving the situation in the South a good deal of thought, but at present we see only one solution to the matter, and that is one which is not available now. We feel that we must press through Congress an enabling act which will place federal authority over the registration and election officials in all of the states, and so make interference with or prevention of the proper execution of the election laws a federal offense. We had hoped to get this enabling act through Congress before its adjournment last spring, but did not get further than the introduction of the measure. We expect to be able to work for the passage of this act at the coming session of Congress." So, the women of the National Women's Party were overly optimistic about their ability to get such a federal law passed. It would be another 40 years before the Voting Rights Act of 1965 became law. Like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton before her, Anna Clemens would not live to have her right to vote. She died in 1956 at the age of 65. Anna meant what she said about keeping her identity private out of fear for repercussions. As far as we know, she took her secret about her letters to her grave. When we contacted her relatives still living in Southport, they were not aware of Anna's letters or her courageous efforts to vote. Copies of Anna's letters, written in 1920 from Southport, North Carolina, are on file with the Library of Congress and in the National Archives of the National Women's Party and the NAACP. So Southport has a right to be proud of all the women in its past who worked for women's rights to vote and who worked to improve the community. We're all better off for the work that they did, and they all deserve to be remembered and honored and celebrated. This is a picture of one such celebration. It was from the 4th of July, 1921. It's taken in front of the Army-Navy Club where they had just finished a pageant. You can see that there's Uncle Sam and there's several women draped in stars and stripes. And in the back, women are wearing sashes that look like they are purple, white, and gold, the colors worn by Alice Paul's suffragists. And now I'll let Carrie Chapman Catt, two-time president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, have the final word. And Mrs. Katz said, "Women have suffered agony of soul which you can never comprehend, that you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Prize it." So that's the end of my presentation today. I'm going to turn the slide screen back around to take questions. Before I do, I just want to mention I've had a few emails from people asking how they can donate to the Historical Society. Of course, all these classes are free, but we always welcome donations. They're not required, but they're certainly nice to have. If you want to make a donation, you can go to our website, go to the store, and there's tabs on there where you can donate. And the same way, if you are feeling excited about Southport history and you want to become a member, the same place in the store, you can get a membership, and it's $15 a year for an individual and $25 a year for a couple. So now I am going to figure out how to stop sharing the screen.